Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. We would like to thank you for joining us for the 17th edition of the Annual Investment Meeting webinar series done in partnership with leading cities. My name is Prashant Udrani, conference producer for AIM, and I'll be your MC for today. The Annual Investment Meeting is the largest investment platform in the world, an initiative of the UAE Ministry of Economy. AIM has been promoting a healthier global economy by linking investment opportunities to fast-growing economies under six key pillars: foreign direct investment, foreign portfolio investment, small and medium enterprise, startups, and future cities, with a special event, One Belt, One Road. We would like to thank our multilateral partner, Islamic Cooperation for the Development of the Private Sector, for sponsoring today's webinar. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you experience any issue with your audio or video during the webinar, just refresh your browser and that should take care of everything. We would suggest using Chrome, Firefox, or Opera. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the question box in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. During the webinar, we will be running live polls located beside the question tab. We would request you to participate by casting your vote. In the webinar today, we'll be covering the topic post-pandemic cities. What will they look like? We shall discuss the impact of the current pandemic on smart cities. What is the future of smart cities? Accelerating adoption of smart city tech to combat COVID-19, building pandemic-proof cities, the need for urban resilience and its strategies. Today, we are joined by Micheal Lake. Micheal is the president and CEO of Leading Cities. As the president and CEO, Micheal has established and developed a relationship with municipal governments, businesses, non-profit organizations, and universities around the world, creating a global network of partner cities dedicated to implement smart city solutions. Micheal has 20 years of experience in public, private, academic, and non-profit sectors, demonstrating collaborative leadership and problem-solving and leadership building skills necessary to compete globally and to derive results. Without further ado, I will turn over the time to our speaker, Micheal Lake. Micheal, welcome on stage. It's good to see you, Micheal.
Thank you, Prashant. It's fabulous to see you too. And thank you so much for that kind introduction. I want to welcome everybody who's joining us. And first want to start by thanking the annual investment meeting for bringing us all together despite the challenges that COVID-19 is creating in terms of gathering in person. I also want to thank the Ministry of Economy and, of course, Daimler Corporation for their continued sponsorship and support of these critical sessions. It's a little awkward for me, I'll be honest with you, to do these virtual sessions, although I am grateful for the opportunity. I'm just used to, walking around a stage using my hands, so sticking within this little box here is going to be somewhat difficult for me. So please all bear with me. And I just want to say that I want to applaud the annual investment meeting, the team, for not only bringing us all together, but to make sure that this challenge of pandemic and global travel is not stopping us from continuing these critical conversations, to gathering us together. And I certainly encourage everybody, as Prashant mentioned, to please, as I'm talking, to put your questions in that side box there. Because we will reserve a chunk of time at the end to really engage in more discussion. And I think that's even more important in these virtual sessions. I will miss not having the opportunity to see you all in person. And I'm sure you feel the same. Although we have to look at the positive of these types of opportunities, I guess. These virtual sessions have made it a little bit easier for us to connect globally, a little bit more convenient. How many of you, I wonder, are sitting at home in your pajamas right now? At least those of us in this time zone. They've certainly made things a little less expensive. They're more environmentally friendly, but it does lack that human connection, which there's really no replacement for. So we'll do our best to keep this as interactive and personal as we can. But most importantly, I do want to thank you for participating, and I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. So let's really just get started here. As Prashant mentioned, my name is Micheal Lake. I'm the president and CEO of Leading Cities. Leading Cities is a global nonprofit organization. We are focused on creating more resilient cities by facilitating sustainability and innovation. We've built a global ecosystem connecting academics and city leaders, nonprofit organizations, smart city solution providers and startups, investors. We see the smart cities as not just a solution to the challenges that cities face in the 21st century, but also an economic development strategy. This is a wave or perhaps the next wave, I should say, of business development and building on the technology that's available to us. We're going to talk a lot today about the impact of COVID-19, and we're going to do this through the lens of a city. So I want to just take a moment to give pause and reflection and mostly tribute to the hardships that families around the world are facing because of this global pandemic. We're not going to talk about, at least not in great detail, those types of hardships that affect all of us so deeply and personally. There's not a person in the world today, I think, that doesn't know somebody that's been deeply affected by this pandemic. We're in about 200, the pandemic has now hit about 200 countries. So it is truly global. I mean, and I want to particularly pay tribute to the loss of life that we've seen, our friends, our neighbors, our loved ones. So forgive me as I go through this presentation and focus on the other impacts of COVID-19, but I didn't want to just get into all of those without recognizing the other incredibly difficult times that people are facing and emotionally charged time. With that, I do want to talk about the overall impact of COVID-19 for cities, and specifically on smart cities and the industry. I'm a glass half full type of guy, trying to always look for that silver lining in every cloud. And I believe that even this has a silver lining, as has every major threat to humanity in our existence. So I think that one of the shifts that we're going to see as a result of COVID-19 is a shift from, within the smart cities industry, that is, a shift from technology itself being the driver of change to really getting back to the basics. When you think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in many ways, the technology advancements that we've witnessed in recent years and decades has propelled us into that city self-actualization, that tip of the pyramid, so to speak. COVID-19 is moving us right back down to the bottom. It's coming back to all of the people in our communities getting access to food and shelter. It's the security, and I don't mean just physical security, but cybersecurity. We really have come right back to the basics on this, and the good news is we don't lose the technology. All of those solutions that were developed and were being driven by the technological advancements are still relevant. It's just a different focus, a different need that's driving cities, I think, in the future to adopt these changes. And frankly, I'll say I think it's a more grounded, more human approach to smart cities, and I think that's what, frankly, the industry needed. So I have a very positive outlook on this. I mean, notwithstanding the hardships that people are currently facing and the economic and social realities that we're going to really deal with over the coming years, months and years. But in the end, we will emerge stronger and more resilient, and I think our cities will be smarter as a result. But this does highlight the need for us to think about the need for new urban resiliency strategies. And frankly, I want to talk a little bit about the semantics of all of this. And I'll start with the term resiliency. It's my personal belief that post COVID-19, one of the biggest shifts we're going to see is the diminishing of the use of the word smart cities and the rising of the use of resilient cities. And I think one of the reasons why smart cities kind of dominated, there's a number of reasons, but one of them is the fact that it was broad. It affected just about every dimension of a city. Whereas there was a kind of a connotation with resiliency that thought, climate change and sea level rise, it was much more specific, much more narrow. But now I think when we talk about resiliency within cities, we're talking about health and security, economic viability and sustainability. These are the things that will shape our communities for generations to come. And technology, as I said, will and can be a driver. So I want to start with our first polling question here to get us started and easing into this. So if you click over to that polls tab on the right side of your screen there, you'll see the question: what do you most associate the term smart cities with? Is it the technology? Is it the sustainability or the resiliency? Is it policies? Is it just a trend you think that's a fad, happening in cities around the world, and a year or two or whenever it will disappear? So please take a moment right now. I'm going to pause a second and ask you to cast your votes. Okay, so we can see that the overwhelming, oh, well, things are shifting. Hold on here. Keep submitting. Well, about half of us see smart cities as technology. And there is no doubt that that is true. Technology is the great, as I said before, driver, but it's the means to which we've been achieving smart cities. I do believe that, as I said, the technology will take more of a backseat moving forward. So the numbers keep rising. We're almost at 60%. Thank you all, by the way, for participating in this. I'm gonna continue on. As I said, I mean, the harshest reality of this pandemic is the loss of life that we have seen globally. I mean, these are just a few examples of nations around the world that have been impacted. It's tragic, and there's nothing else to say about it. I think what this ultimately means, and try not to get too morbid here, is that we see cities being affected, of course, more than rural areas. That does not come as a surprise, especially when you're talking about a virus that's passed through human interconnectedness and contact. And the reality is that interconnectedness and contact that exists in cities because of its density is one of the great lifebloods of a city. It's what brings us our innovation and job creation and all the rest. And unfortunately, in this situation, it's hindering our experiences within cities. So I do believe that one of the short-term outcomes of COVID-19 will be a development of fear, fear of being in high-density areas. I think it will drive some people, perhaps many, out of cities and more into the kind of urban sprawl. A suburban sprawl, really. I think that also creates actually opportunities. One of the greatest challenges in highly populated cities is the cost of housing. I think we'll see a diminishing in that cost, which will bring new people into cities that people that couldn't afford in the past to live in cities. I think we'll see a short-term slowdown in population growth. We're already experiencing that in cities here in the U.S. There's also, of course, the financial impact. And this is just one slide, just to be illustrative of the impact that this has had on stock markets, and that financial impact is very serious. Estimates are projecting that as much as a 2% per month global reduction in economic growth. This is a serious impact in our financial markets and our economies. I don't have to tell any of you the realities of what it's like for small businesses in our communities. Those restaurants and theaters and small retail shops. When you think about it, these are the very same things that were the amenities that drew people into cities. So I do think that there will be an adjustment, and some people moving into cities will have very different reasons for moving into the city than people have had recently. We're going to see continued job losses. I think there's no doubt about that, as unfortunate as it is. But as I said before, I'm a guy who believes the glass is always half full. And historically, when you look at previous pandemics throughout history, after the pandemic passes, you do see that, particularly in cities, there are higher wages created because of the vacancy of jobs. The job availability and the higher wages being offered attract more people back into the cities. And, in every pandemic, I think in history, there were those who believed that this was the end of cities, that cities would never be rebuilt the way they had existed before. And in every situation, we know that cities come back, they come back stronger. And I think this will be no different. Another impact that we're seeing is the pollution in cities and the reduction of that pollution. Here's some satellite images from Europe. These are just reminders of what it's like to breathe clean air. I think it will help us to develop and drive more environmental concerns and solutions, ultimately actions, as the industries get back up and running and threaten our environment. I think we're going to see more resistance to that. And there's opportunity out there for smart city solutions to address these challenges as well. When you look at a place like India, it's a tremendous impact. These are the satellite images, but what does that mean day to day on the ground? And look at the difference from the left to the right of that picture. The pollution change has been astronomical. And this is in cities around the world. I think one of the areas that doesn't get quite as much attention, frankly, yet as I personally think it should, is around cybersecurity. ISACA, has done this survey of 3,700 IT audit, risk, governance, and cybersecurity professionals. Now, these numbers are not specific to cities. This is overall. But this survey was done across 123 countries in mid-April, so post-pandemic. And you can see here some of the staggering numbers. 92% say that cyber attackers will be increasing their cyber attacks on individuals. But we see this is true already in the corporate setting and certainly in the government side. State and local governments have been the main target for ransomware attacks. Here in the U.S., we've seen a number of cities dealing with this. I personally believe that with the increase of remote work and that being rolled out in such an emergency fashion and so quickly, that the exposure cities and companies, but in this case cities, have had in terms of increased vulnerability I mean, when remote work first started, we hadn't yet shut down all of our restaurants and cafes. So it's very likely that city employees were not only working on personal devices, but they may have been using public Wi-Fi, sitting at a cafe all day. Um, I mean, these are serious threats to our digital systems within cities, and the way ransomware works, for those who don't know, is that the ransomware is inserted into the system, and it can be weeks that it runs throughout the system, infiltrating further and further, deeper and deeper, and then finally it is like turned on, and systems shut down, and the city is held for ransom, or city operations are held for ransom. So it would not surprise me in the least. In fact, I believe strongly that there are, fortunately, many cities around the world who probably have ransomware running throughout their system as we speak and don't even know it yet. At a time like this, where you have such incredible threat to society, imagine shutting down a city's emergency response system. I do think that, by the way, one of the real issues that we have facing cities in this regard is that in the past we've had limited IT budgets, poor governance, and frankly overstretched resources that haven't provided the focus on cybersecurity that cities really need. I do believe that this pandemic will reshape that. And we're going to see a more intense focus on cyber resiliency moving forward. Now, what is the future of smart cities? I was talking a little while ago about the terminology smart cities. And for all of you know well that this term developed just over a decade ago, primarily by IBM. And what is it really? Personally, I'm not a big fan of the term, I'll be honest with you. First of all, I don't think it's just limited to cities. I think it's all communities. I do think that the word smart tends to focus, as we now see our poll is up over 60%, believe that it's focused on technology. And I don't think the concept, the underlying concept of smart cities is really about just technology. I believe that smart cities is just a 21st century term for city evolution. And when you look back, and you see some photos here, when you think about the Romans building aqueducts and paving roads, or you think about the first traffic signals, or on the bottom right there, the first sewer systems. And now you look in the middle there, it's things like public Wi-Fi. All of these items were smart city solutions at their time. So really, smart cities is really just about the next phase of city evolution. This particular phase happens to be driven by technology and the advancements in technology. And frankly, I think it's going to help our cities grow faster and better serve communities than any of the past smart city innovations. So my feeling is that even if the term smart cities is not used as frequently as it is today, and it should shift to something like resilient cities, the underlying concept is still there, and it's not going anywhere. The need for this evolution is consistent and constant. But there is a question about the implementation of smart city projects. And these numbers came out this year, but before the impacts of COVID-19. So you can see a steady increase being projected. I believe that we'll still see an increase overall. I do believe that in the next year or so, we will see a diminishing of investments in some smart city solutions. I think we'll see an increase in others. As I said before, as we emerge from this crisis situation and we get back into the rebuilding of our cities, we're going to see that shift in not just thinking about, let's say, smart parking as a convenience. We're going to start thinking about it as a strategy. How do you use smart parking solutions to better control the flow of people, so that you can reduce the interactions if you need to, or the proximity of people in cities. There's another reality that we're going to face in terms of any city project, whether it's a smart city project or not, which is just the financial resources cities will have to deal with this, to pay for it. In U.S. cities alone, we're projecting a loss of about $360 billion of revenue between 2020 to 2022. It's going to force cities to really have to prioritize. And so, as I said before, some solutions will be put on the back burner for a little while, but other solutions are going to rise to the top and help cities in that rebuilding effort. Just to put this into other perspective in terms of how many cities, 88% of cities do expect a shortfall in their revenue as a result of COVID-19. And when you look at cities with populations of between 50,000 to 500,000, so those kind of mid-sized cities, 98% expect a shortfall. So it's a pretty universal challenge that I think cities are going to have. Now, just looking at cities and how they've operated around smart cities in the past for a moment, it will come as no surprise to anyone in the industry that cities have been risk averse, we'll say, more cautious than some of us would have liked. And the reality here is that, at least my thought around this, is that there is a perceived risk that city employees have. And the classic example that I always use is, if it's your job to make sure that all the roads in the city are paved, you have an option. You could look at some of these new solutions around solar panels being used instead of asphalt, and all the economic and environmental benefits that can come from that. It's a new revenue stream for cities, so on and so forth. Or you look at asphalt and paving roads the way we've been paving them for decades. The reality is, with that new innovative technology to do roads, the individual, the city staff that have to make that decision, perceive risk there. And there is, I suppose, some amount of risk. But if they go out on that limb and adopt that innovative solution, whether it's roads or anything else, and something should go wrong, the perception is their job, their livelihood is at risk. But if they do things the way they've been done for the last 50 years, nobody's going to question it. And that has been that underlying belief or tendency, really, to do things the way they've always been done, I think has been the most significant roadblock for the deployment of smart city solutions to date. That being said, overall, I think we will see a short-term, very short-term stalling of the smart cities industry, just while we're getting through this crisis. And then I think we're going to see increased growth and at a faster rate. What this pandemic has exposed is that doing things the way they've always been done, not being proactive and not being prepared for the threats of the 21st century, have a cost. And there's going to be more accountability for our public leaders to be more prepared, to invest in that preparedness. And so I do believe that in the long term, the smart city industry will see that increase in economic growth or industry growth, and at a faster pace. Because ultimately, smart city solutions or resilient cities have moved from being a nice to have, and you get accolades for being innovative, to a must have, where you get criticized for not being innovative. And that's a significant shift. Now, again, I want to take pause and engage with you with another polling question. So if you jump back over to that poll section. And the next question, and I'm not seeing it on my side. Sorry, there we go. So the next question is, do you agree that your municipality has that type of leadership and the culture? It's not just about our elected leaders. It's the culture within city government to be innovative, to take risks, to make the investments for the long term. And by long term, I'm just talking the next 5+ years to benefit the community. So please take a moment, submit your vote, and I'm really interested to see the response on this one. Wow. Oh. This is very interesting. So it's kind of in that 20% range right across. And I think that's not all that surprising. I think what we have seen is two things. One, that cities are being more open to these solutions over the last decade. If we asked this question a decade ago, we probably all would have been in that strongly disagree column. But now, I mean, just looking at these results right now, strongly agree, strongly disagree, and somewhat disagree are all equal. But the highest is somewhat agree. So it's positive in the end. And I do think that the leadership we have in place today has not really been challenged to be innovative. They have had the opportunity, but they haven't had the challenge. And this pandemic is that challenge. So I believe that they are very capable of being innovative to overcome that risk aversion. And that's what I think will drive this continued growth and at a faster pace of the smart city industry. So just want to, this is a US example here, because that's what the data I had, but just a reality check on the financial situation. I mean, the revenue loss facing cities is certainly no joke. As I said, $360 billion this year and the following 2 years. But what we find is that, a 1% increase in unemployment can result in over a 3% budget shortfall for cities, towns, and villages, and that's a significant risk. I mean, as we see unemployment numbers skyrocket, and they'll start to rebound, of course, as more and more businesses are allowed to open and the economy gets back to its pre-COVID-19 operations. We will see at least a reduction in that unemployment, which is obviously a good thing, but it's not going to erase the impact that this period of unemployment will have on cities. So that those limited resources that were already limited and have become more limited will be, I think, the immediate challenge that cities will have. But I do think that the pressure for cities to find ways to become more resilient is going to be so strong that limited resources will be better prioritized. And I do think that smart city solutions will have an increasing share of those resources moving forward. Of course, all of this is really talking about what is the future of city design and what do our cities look like. So this is going to affect every aspect of cities. I'm just going to focus on a couple, but it affects transportation, public space, housing, service delivery, you name it. I think all of these dimensions of cities design are going to be reconsidered, reimagined. I mean, when you think of mass transit, it's a lot of empty seats, and as we know, mass transit is the economics of mass transit is that most systems are run very heavily based on the ridership and the money that people pay to ride as their main revenue driver. When you have such decreases in the use of public transportation, you're going to see the budgets impacted there as well. I can tell you, I'm here in Boston, and the lack of investment in our public transportation system and the maintenance and upgrades of that system have been accumulating for years. This is certainly not going to help. But we do see other alternatives develop and developing. More microtransit and those partnerships that we've seen develop between organizations like Lyft and Uber with public transit authorities to connect people, sometimes at no cost, to public transit systems. I think we'll see that. We'll see shorter distances probably being covered by more bikes, as we see an increase in bike lanes and street closures to bike lanes, which I'll talk about in the next slide, but also in terms of ride sharing. I mean, it's a lot safer when you think about it for anybody who's fearing that interaction with too many people to be even in a shared car with 2 or 3 other people than it is to be on a subway train with hundreds of people. We're seeing now that just with social distancing in place, a 40-foot bus that would have had a capacity of over 50 people will now have a capacity, if they recognize social distancing, of about 8 people. So the economics of mass transit during this pandemic and the aftermath are really broken and will have to be reimagined. Our roads themselves, in this example where streets are being converted to bike only, but we're seeing this around the world. New York City has begun trialing 7 miles of open streets, to not for bikes, but open streets to ease the crowding that they're seeing in places like Central Park and those green spaces. In Oakland, California, almost 10% of the roadways have been closed to through traffic. In Milan, Italy, plans to build 22 miles of new bicycle lanes and permanently widening sidewalks after the lockdown lifts is already in place. Bogota, Colombia, has opened 47 miles of temporary bike lanes. Budapest has suggested already that its new bike lanes may become permanent. And the Paris's mayor, Anne Hidalgo, has already called returning to a car-dominated status quo, quote, out of the question. So the design on cities, roads, and shifting, at least in some places, from that car-dominated system is going to have real impacts on people and on the environment. Our public spaces, from transit, as we talked about, to our street furniture, are going to be reimagined and redesigned. That bottom right-hand photo, you'll see those are our tables and seats with a socially distanced circle painted around it. So passers-by can honor that 6-foot or 2-meter distance. Our green spaces, similarly to those painted circles, the picture on the left is a tubular system. You can connect the tubes and it provides that same distance around you. So it's mobile, so you can place it within a green space. The park on the right was already designed by a firm. Those are 4-foot high hedges It's designed to allow people to walk around, to engage with that green space while also remaining socially distant. So even our green spaces may transform from the openness you see on the left to more design featured on the right. Overall, before we wrap up and move to questions, and I see some have already started putting out questions, please take a moment to put your question, add your question to the list, and review them, and please vote for one you like. I will take a moment to look at those and trying to sort them by those that are most popular amongst us. But in terms of smart city advancement, as I said before, this is really a challenge of, do we do things the way we've always been doing? Recognizing that the same old thinking creates the same old results. It is that definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. It just never pans out. I believe that the impacts of remote work and online services are going to have some lasting impacts, and that it has forced the acceleration of the adoption of smart city solutions. Whether you're talking about more cybersecurity solutions as a result of remote work, a shift in mindset that people do not have to be in the office to be productive. And I've seen various numbers on this, but one number to share is a 7% increase in productivity in the workplace, I guess you could say, work from home scenario. So productivity doesn't seem to be impacted in some industries. In fact, it seems to improve. We've seen more global communication and collaboration among cities. Leading cities has been built on this philosophy that cities cannot achieve their smarter, more resilient status without collaborating. Frankly, we, like so many cities, accelerated our own adoption of new technology. We launched, or we were planning to launch on a beta test form, and ultimately later this year, a global platform to connect the smart city ecosystem, from investors and startups and solution providers to city leaders. And because of COVID-19, the Leading Cities Circle was launched to connect cities directly. We've seen some governments share things like the apps that they have developed, apps that either help access city services or those that help with contact tracing. So anyways, I think that leading cities has already been changed. I think our cities in general are changing. And the status quo is most definitely a threat to cities. So this acceleration in innovation, as I said before, is no longer a nicety, it is a necessity. So let's pause it again, and I'm curious to know, how positive or negative do you think the long-term, again, 5+ years, impacts of this pandemic will be on cities? Again, mixed results here. I'm glad to see that no long-term impact and very negative impact are the lowest. And more than half of us believe that it will be somewhat or very positive. And that's also encouraging. I agree with you. I do think that there are some negative impacts that will last a very long time. But I think overall, this is an opportunity. And I'm glad to see so many of us share that opinion. I'll conclude here and leave you on a positive note, to say that, as Jay Sammet said it best, every threat to the status quo is an opportunity in disguise. Our opportunity is to transform our cities, not incrementally, but with dramatic changes, with people at the very core of that decision-making process. In the United States, our Native Americans had a philosophy that I think captures resiliency and in that decision-making process. And that philosophy is that of the 7 generations. This belief that any decision made should be made not with yourself or your children or even your grandchildren in mind, but with the impact that your decision would have 7 generations from now. This philosophy shows that long-term thinking that unfortunately I think cities have had the luxury of not worrying about for a long period of time. Now that has changed. The rationale behind that is no longer as strong as it once was, and I think it will create a more sustainable, more resilient world for all of us. I do think that there is a transition in place from that industrial revolution to a more societal revolution. Again, putting people first. And smart cities, I believe, is a driving force of that. I do believe that although technology, as I said a couple times already, that though technology has driven the smart city industry to date, it is the impact on people and that greater impact on community that will drive smart cities moving forward. And I believe strongly that most of the solutions that have been developed within the smart city space have been developed with that ultimate goal in mind anyways, to improve communities. So I think we're seeing an alignment of decision-making and industry drivers to the purpose of smart cities in the first place. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us and listening to me. And now we're going to shift to some of these questions that you have. So Karen, I see that your question is, what is my best positive advice? I like that. As a first step to come to those companies or tech startups who decided to shut down and file for bankruptcy, but with really good technology and ideas to offer. As you said, it's a time for more innovative and evolution. I totally agree with you. And my positive advice is somewhat related to, I think, the ongoing challenges, especially for startups in the smart city industry. I mean, let's face it. The public procurement process alone does not equate a simple or a quick sales cycle. I believe strongly, we actually run a global smart city startup competition. In fact, Monday is the deadline for applications for this year. I mean, we do offer a cash prizes of $125,000. But we also provide a curriculum and contacts and developing a self-identified qualified lead pipeline for the startups to get off the ground. And I think in this example, and to answer your question, I always talk to our startups that go through that program in the sense that they are often focused, and understandably so, on money, having that cash on hand. They have to figure out how to pay the bills this week or next month. But as I often say, the investment is important, because if you think of a startup as a plane trying to take off, investment gives you runway. And you can't take off without a long enough runway. But if you don't have lift, a plane will eventually hit the end of the runway, no matter how long it is. And the lift that startups in the smart city space need are clients. They need cities to invest in that solution, to adopt it, deploy it. So in this case, it is the idiom is true that your best investor is a client. I think that the innovation drive, the necessity for that innovation in cities is going to help this a little bit. But again, the economic impacts facing cities, the realities of just climbing out of this a crisis are going to stall that initial response for some time. So I think that you're going to see startups face a challenge in the near term, but I do think that there is greater opportunity. So your question um, is right on point. How can we actually help them get through this period? And I would say, don't take your ideas off the shelf, even if it means you have to close shop. The conversations can still happen. The website can still stay up. The focus may have to be on something else, or a gig economy type job to get through. But the horizon for when smart city startups will have that opportunity again is not that far off, I hope. I see several more questions, so I'm going to try and make my answers a little bit shorter. How's that? Nasim is asking, what can national leadership do to combine factors and create new models? Pandemic recovery, follow the trail of silence. So I think national leaders, one of the great opportunities we have at the national level. And this is something we have lacked in the US. I think in places like the EU or India, you've seen it in much greater existence to this point, where national governments are supportive and focused on cities. I think that's the right way to be. I think we will see more economic relief to cities. And I think that's one of the best things that national governments can do right now is drive some of that investment towards cities specifically. But I also think national governments have a role to play in standards development, and helping cities to get over this fear of deploying new technologies, by kind of adopting standards that make that decision a little bit easier. I serve on the World Economic Forum's working group to develop such standards around cybersecurity, for instance. That will be this is in partnership with the G20. So there are efforts underway. I think more of that is certainly helpful. And we've seen challenges, whether it's the EU or the US government or whatnot, where challenges for that investment dollars have been made for cities to compete and access those resources. We have another question. To please discuss the role of new technologies, example of artificial intelligence in the post-COVID cities. What needs to be done to support its increased use? So actually, I serve on another committee for the United Nations around artificial intelligence in cities, and we're having this very conversation right now. I'll be honest, we don't have an answer just yet. But we are seeing that artificial intelligence, and there are reasons that people have fears and concerns of artificial intelligence. But we also see that there is tremendous opportunity. So I think the role of new technologies, including artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles. Actually, I didn't even talk about autonomous vehicles. Coming to the transportation issues that we're going to see, and the impacts on mass transit. I do believe that, if you asked me this last year, I would have said autonomous vehicles in kind of a becoming normal solution in cities was probably, in my opinion, 2 decades out. I do think that this pandemic is accelerating that. I think we see that autonomous vehicles can allow for efficient transport of people, even goods, and that it can be done so in smaller numbers. Artificial intelligence, as I said, does have concerns, but when you think about the data that is being developed And the more smart city technologies, the more sensors, the more autonomous vehicles, the more of these technologies that get deployed in cities, the more data that's going to be available. And AI is our key to unlocking the power of that data, understanding it, applying it, making better decisions based on it. These numbers have changed, so it's a slightly outdated number I haven't updated. But I gave a speech over a year ago now. But I was talking about the increase in connected devices and the data that's being produced as a result. I mean, it's every single day, it's the equivalent of every single month, it's the equivalent of about 150 million iPhones being filled to capacity in their data storage. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of data that's being generated, and artificial intelligence will help us sort through that. Another question: what type of policies or regulations do you look forward to being implemented towards smart cities? So, as I said, I serve on two committees, one around artificial intelligence, one around cybersecurity. I do think that cybersecurity is my top priority in terms of policy development. And I say that not because I think that that's a more important solution, but I think it's a more important foundation. I think that cyber attack, especially using IoT devices, that each one is a new point of vulnerability for a city's digital system, will increase fears and slow that adoption rate. So I think once we have cybersecurity policy in place, or strong cybersecurity policies in place, we will see that people become more comfortable, less fearful, and more adoption of new technologies will be realized. Another question: what must a city? I'm just being mindful of our time. We have just a few minutes left here, so I'm going to be a little faster here. What must a city or cities do to be more resilient, and what are those benefits? As I said, resiliency had this focus on climate change and sea level rise, and those are still just as relevant as they were. But I think what we're going to see moving forward is things like economic sustainability, and how we think about the jobs that are being created, those that are essential workers, how we deal with non-essential workers when there isn't a need or there is a pandemic, for instance, in place. I think equitable issues or issues of equity within cities is going to be a big factor that we need to consider. And this pandemic has exposed those inequities in ways that we knew existed, but were oftentimes unwilling to recognize or unable to address. I think this situation has really cast new light and exposure on those challenges, and there will be pressure to do things about it. I mean, we see what's happening right now in the U.S. and the protests that are going on around police brutality. But the inequities exist, whether you're talking economic inequities, digital divide. I mean, there's so many examples of this. So I think looking at that might be the most impactful on the human experience within cities. But there are a number of things that resilient cities will have to consider and adopt to move forward. I mean, like I said before, even food supply chains and crisis management, all of these things are going to need to be part of the resiliency strategy for cities. Let's see. Smart city helps in deliverables, but after the loss of livelihood, how poor people would get the benefit of smart city infrastructure owing to cost of livelihood. So I think that this is building, and I've just realized we've hit our time here, so I'll make this our last question. But I do think that the poor in our cities is going to be a main focus. It should be a main focus. Frankly, it should have been a main focus. But I think, as I was just saying, the inequities that have been exposed from this pandemic are bringing that right to the forefront. And whether you're talking about health or income or whatever it is, I've often used this analogy of a boat, and if you think of like the economy as the boat, and those that the haves will say are in the boat, and the have-nots are like the anchor. And every boat captain knows that you have three options. You either don't move, you try and move forward while dragging that anchor behind you and not get very far very fast, or you bear the burden of lifting the anchor and carrying it, knowing that you're going to get much further much faster. And I think that reality is going to help shape city leaders' decision making and our approach to building stronger communities, smarter, more resilient cities. With that, I do want to thank you all for joining us. I'm sorry I've now run a minute over here. I want to thank you for all your questions. And Prashant, thank you for bringing us all together.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. There was a lot of facts and figures I'm sure we all were not aware about, but we are learning a lot from that presentation. So thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. I would like to thank our sponsors, the Islamic Corporation for the Development of the Private Sector, for sponsoring today's webinar. I would also like to thank our audience for joining us and for sharing their questions. The link to today's presentation, which Michael has just presented, will be shared to you via email. Plus, you will be getting an access to the webinar video as well. We are conducting a short survey to get your feedback on today's webinar. The link to the survey will be shared to you via my team on the chat and via email. To register for our next webinar scheduled for the 15th of June 2020, please visit our website www.aimcongress.com/webinars. Also follow us on our social media channels to keep yourself updated. Thank you all once again. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you.
My pleasure. Stay safe, everybody.
You too, Michael. Bye-bye.
Thank you.